Hey y'all, Coach in the Fight here, talking about Pentecost. This is Hermas Academy, and as you know, around the holy day seasons, we always put out several classes related to the feast days. We are the repairers of the breach, closing the gap, rebuilding the paths to dwell in, and we understand that those pathways back to our Father are going to go through the feast days. These feast days are extremely important. And so as we do every year, we talk about these feast days leading up to the holy convocations, putting out as much biblical information as we possibly can so that people are aware of what is expected of us during these feast days. Now, we just put out a very popular video yesterday on when the Feast of Pentecost is, when the Feast of First Fruits falls in the year 2020. If you haven't checked out that video, you'll know that it falls on June the 6th of 2020 based on Scripture. But now, there are many people who was expecting Pentecost to fall on May the 31st. And so the purpose of this video is to show you why May 31st was the wrong date. We wanted to wait till after May the 31st to do this class because we knew that many people would reject the idea that somehow May the 31st was incorrect. And here on June the 2nd, many of those same people will be more welcome to the idea and ready to learn why May 31st was the wrong date. Well, let me show you how and why May 31st was in fact the wrong date. Now, the first thing I want to show you is that when you go in and you look at Pentecost 2020, it shows you the date of Pentecost on the Gregorian calendar. If you look at the calendar on the wall, it's going to say that Pentecost fell on May the 31st. But let me show you something interesting. If you put in Pentecost 2019, it says it fell on June the 9th, which was a Sunday. But if you look at 2018, it says May the 20th, which is also a Sunday. If you look at 2017, it was a Sunday. If you look at 2016, it was a Sunday. 15 was a Sunday. 14 was a Sunday. Now, I could keep going down through these dates here on Google, showing you that all the way back in time, as far as you want to go, Pentecost is always going to show up on a Sunday. Now, if you know anything about the sacred calendar, which we learn about in Genesis chapter 1, and verse 14, you know that the sacred calendar, the calendar that was given to us by our Father, is supposed to be based on the luminaries, based on the sun, based on the moon, and the other stars up there. Those are what the Father, the Creator, gave us in order for us to be able to tell the seasons and the days and the years. That is our calendar. That's why they derived the word month from the word moon. That's how we're supposed to know what month it is. And so understanding this, we understand that there's no way that every Pentecost is supposed to fall on a Sunday. I don't want to go into too much detail in this, as we have covered many classes on how to determine the Sabbath day, how to determine the holy days, how to determine the feast days, how the luminaries work, so you can check those out on our channel. So what you should be asking is, how are they coming up with these feast days? How did they pick May 31st? How does May 31st show up on our calendar for the date of Pentecost in 2020? Well, if you jump over on Google and look at how is Pentecost determined, it says, according to church tradition, Pentecost is always about 7 weeks after Easter Sunday, or 50 days after Easter, including Easter Day. And when you put in Google, how is Pentecost calculated, it says the date of Pentecost is 7 weeks after Easter Sunday. That is to say, the 50th day after Easter, inclusive of Easter Sunday. In other words, they're picking Pentecost based on Easter. This is why they chose May 31st for the date of Pentecost, because they're starting from the date of Easter. Now, I do recognize that Easter is a popular Christian holiday, and it is not my intent to go into the origins of Easter in this video. But I do want to show you that how choosing Easter as the beginning of the 50-day count is actually in error. Now, there are a lot of people who will point out how Easter is actually in our Bible. It's actually in the King James Bible. If you jump over to Acts chapter 12, you will see that Easter is mentioned there in verse 4. And there are many people that will use this verse in order to say that Easter is actually a biblical holiday and not just a holiday adopted by the Christian church in later times. Now, I'm going to show you in a slide or two how that is in fact the case. But right here, I want to show you something about Easter and where it's mentioned in the Bible. Now, here it is in Acts chapter 12. Now, what's going on here in the book of Acts chapter 12 is King Herod is actually killing the disciples. He's already killed James, the brother of John there, you see in verse 2. And he's getting ready to kill Peter, you see there in verse 3. But you look there in verse 4, how he's waiting until after Easter in order to kill Peter. Now, if you think about this for a second, you can see that Easter was already in effect well before the Messiah ever came to the earth. We recognize Easter as the celebration of the resurrection of Christ today. But if you look at it, Herod was already celebrating Easter only a few years after Christ has been crucified. Does that make sense to you? The King Herod, who didn't believe in the Messiah and who is now killing his disciples, was celebrating his resurrection? No. Easter was well in effect before the Messiah was ever crucified. Like I said, I don't plan to go into the history of Easter in this video, but feel free to do so. Go ahead and look at where the Easter holiday came from before it was adopted as a Christian holiday. Jumping back over at Google, we can find out how and when Easter was actually made a Christian holiday. Like we said, it was in effect long before the Messiah ever came to earth. They have been celebrating Easter even before King Solomon. But you see here that the Council of Nicaea in 312 AD decreed Easter as a Christian holiday. This is the early Catholic Church during the Council of Nicaea making Easter as a recognized holiday in the Christian church. This is why Christians celebrate Easter to this day. It came from the Catholic Church in 325 AD. Now, this is of concern for many people who understand end times prophecy, because they understand that one of the things that will take place is a change in the laws and the times. Well, this is understandable considering that they have changed the Feast of Pentecost, which should have been calculated after the Holy Feast of Unleavened Bread, to be calculated based on Easter. In other words, they changed the date of Pentecost. Now, we cover that in many classes we have done on when is Pentecost. Now, we cover that in a lot of classes that we've done, including one we've done recently called When is Pentecost 2020, and a class called Pentecost is the day and the hour, as well as this class here called Pentecost Shavuot and the events of the third month. Those classes go into great detail as to how the scripture tells us when the date of Pentecost is supposed to fall. And it has nothing to do with Easter. It has a lot to do with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And like we said earlier, we go into great detail about these holy days as they approach each year. And one thing we talked about leading up to the Feast of Unleavened Bread is Exodus chapter 13 and verse 9. It's talking about how the Feast of Unleavened Bread is a sign to be put up on the hand and between our eyes. In other words, the Feast of Unleavened Bread is the mark of the Father. So this is why so many people are concerned about Sunday law and the changing of the holy days, is because these holy days are the mark of the Most High. Whereas many people are looking for the mark of the beast here in the end times. It is understandable that many people are thinking that changing those feast days and observing the feast days on the incorrect day could somehow be related to the mark of the beast. So changing the Feast of Pentecost from the end of the Feast of Unleavened Bread to 50 days after the date of Easter is not only incorrect, but it could actually be deadly. But I remind you where we got that from in the first place, the Catholic Church. But I digress. See, when we look over in the book of Leviticus, chapter 23, which is the only place that lists all of the feast days in one place, we see down here in verse 10 that the 50 days leading up to the date of Pentecost was actually supposed to start at the end of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, if you do it correctly, this lands you on the 14th day of the month Sivan, which in the year 2020 is June the 6th. But let me show you something else about the date of Pentecost looking in Leviticus chapter 23. We see in verse 18 that Pentecost is actually supposed to be a sacrificial day, a day that they made sacrifices. They sacrificed flour, the first fruits, even lambs and bulls and rams were all sacrificed on the 14th day of the third month. Now, this should remind you of the day of Passover, which was the 14th day of the first month, which was also a sacrificial day. But now we also understand that the 15th day of the month is the Sabbath day. I don't want to go into too great a detail on how that all works in this class. We've done many classes on how to determine the Sabbath day on the biblical calendar. But just understand that Passover was a sacrificial day, but the 15th day, the first day of unleavened bread, was called a high holy day or a high Sabbath day. Well, it should be easy to see that the 14th day of the third month, also being a sacrificial day, would make the 15th day of the third month a high Sabbath day. Like we said, we're always digging out biblical facts over here in Hermas Academy. So you may have never heard that before. But study, pray, and meditate on it and see, don't you find that it is true. Now, I bring that all up to show you something that occurred on the 16th day of the third month. It was on the 16th day of the third month that Moses received the 2 tables of stone of the law and of the commandment. The 10 commandments that was given to Moses in stone, he got those on the 16th day of the third month. So you have a sacrifice being made to the Most High on the 14th day of the month, followed by a Sabbath day on the 15th day of the month, and then the Mosaic covenant being made on the 16th day of the month, or the stone tablets being given to Moses on the 16th day of the month. And I found that to be significant. Now, that information all comes from the book of Jubilees, chapter 1. But let me show you something over here in the book of Jubilees, chapter 6. It starts off talking about how Noah got off of the ark in the 3rd month. The month Sivan, the same month that Pentecost falls. But you see down here in verse 4 and some of the other verses that this is when the covenant with Noah was made. You see right here in verse 21 that the feast of first fruits is twofold and of double nature, according to what is written and engraven concerning it. Meaning there's 2 reasons why we celebrate the feast of first fruits. We see up here in verse 17, one of which is to renew the covenant. It says here in chapter 6 that the feast of first fruits is the covenant feast. I don't mean to belabor the point, but we see this to be the case when we look at the story of Jacob, how the Most High once again came down and talked to Jacob on the 16th day of the 3rd month. So we see how important the middle of the 3rd month is, and how the feast of first fruits starts these events in the middle of the 3rd month. So I hope it's reaching your heart how important it is to get the date of Pentecost correct. We can't just choose an arbitrary date. We can't just pick any date we want. Just because we like Easter don't mean we can pick Easter as the start of the 50-day count. If we do, we're going to end up celebrating Pentecost on the wrong date. As like in the year 2020, they will celebrate the feast a week early. But those who are following the Catholic Church doctrine are doing just that. So you have to ask yourself, are you Catholic? Or do you pick your holy feast days based on the Bible?